I am a graduate student in the history department at Cal State LA, currently on track to complete my thesis and graduate next month. I graduated from UCLA in 1982 with a BS in mathematics and computer science, worked as a systems engineer for many years, and returned to school in 2015 to study Spanish and history. My research interests center on the shared histories of Latino people that straddle the southern border and the transformation of their culture. I spend my free time biking along the Venice and Santa Monica beaches I grew up on and hiking in our local Santa Monica mountains. This paper was completed a year ago as a 22-page article that has now been incorporated into a 150-page thesis. The work has been expanded to document mid-20th century Mexican immigration during the 1950s, including Braceto and undocumented labor. The challenges of belonging that came from the rising nationalism of the era manifesting in the US with an ideology of Mexican Americanism, and the subsequent loss of the Spanish language by many Mexican Americans. In total, the thesis uses about 15 oral interviews with undocumented laborers, braceros, wives of braceros, and Mexican Americans. In addition, the 1950 census data was released in April of this year, and the census work incorporates the new data available from the 1950s. My research examines the experiences of two parallel migrations to Los Angeles from Mexico and New Mexico during the 1950s and 1960s. My goal is to recover the silent subaltern voices of these migrations. Note the term Nuevo Mexicano, New Mexican, signifies a regional identity that is still in use today, much like Tejano, and refers to the descendants of the Spanish colony established 4 centuries ago in northern New Mexico. With Mexican independence in 1821, the people became Mexican nationals, uniting the many patrias chicas with regional identities such as Tejanos, Nuevo Mexicanos, Poblanos, and Tapatíos. A common Mexicano identity existed based on language, religion, and culture. After the 1848 Treaty of Guadalupe-Hidalgo, the US-Mexico border crossed 60,000 Nuevo Mexicanos that had to make a difficult decision. They could remain on their family's land, become US citizens, and risk the possibility of violent expulsion like the Tejanos, or they could leave their homes and repatriate to farmland being offered in Chihuahua by the Mexican government. Their descendants' collective memory, shaped by historiography, is that attitudes and identities drifted apart on both sides of the border. But did they? A century later, a generation of young adults migrated from rural New Mexico and Mexico to the post-war industrial boom underway in Los Angeles. This work examines the Latino migrant narrative and contributes an alternate path forward that broadens the Latino experience by acknowledging the role of migrant US citizens in a borderlands kinship network. Diverse rationale and agency add historical complexity to the conventional unidirectional immigrant narrative. In 1848, some saw repatriation as an opportunity, while others feared becoming victims of the violence happening in Texas and California. In mid-20th century Los Angeles, migrants from New Mexico and Mexico had a complex relationship, but were united by shared experiences as wage laborers with an intertwined kinship network. I examine the reductive myth that Latino Los Angeles is an immigrant-only story. This immigrant discourse positions Latinos weakly as the beneficiaries of immigration, instead of recognizing their rights on land they have lived on for centuries. Added historical complexity recenters the history by acknowledging that the US Southwest was part of Mexico and the Mexicans never left. Histories are selective, and one of my goals is to recover silenced Latino voices to fill a gap in existing scholarship. 3 dimensions of shared experiences are examined to intentionally break down myths that make distinctions between Nuevo Mexicanos, Mexican immigrants, and their Mexican American children, neighborhoods, employment, and social life. The layered methodology includes a top-down demographic analysis of US Census data and a bottom-up approach to add voices and lives to the historical record using letters, newspapers, and oral interviews. Historian Jose Angel Hernandez's transnational scholarship questions the clean nation-state divisions between imagined political communities. Hernandez reverses the immigrant narrative by explaining that after 1848, an estimated 25% of the Mexicans in the Southwest repatriated to Mexico. Most of the migration from Texas and California was under duress, but the repatriation was voluntary in New Mexico, where Anglos remained a minority. He intentionally counters the directionality of the current Latino migrant discourse. The gap in the literature on Latino repatriates that rejected U.S. citizenship has avoided tarnishing the prize and echoes Trio's concept of silencing history as unthinkable. When the Southwest changed hands, the Nuevo Mexicanos who repatriated to Chihuahua left behind relatives, and their family networks were extended transnationally. The perspective of Laura Gomez's Manifest Destinies, the Making of the Mexican-American Race, is adopted to recenter the foundational Chicano narrative on treaty citizens in New Mexico as the starting point of Mexican-American history. Gomez uses the term treaty citizen to describe the 115,000 Mexicans living in the Southwest, the majority in New Mexico, who became citizens in 1848. She states that to understand modern Nuevo Mexicano identity requires comprehending that the people join U.S. society involuntarily, not as immigrants, but as a people conquered in war. The U.S. wrestled for over 60 years before granting statehood in 1912 to a territory with a majority population that was Mexican, Catholic, and spoke Spanish. Historians have used a variety of lenses to narrate how Nuevo Mexicanos negotiated identity with Anglo society to maintain their legal rights, land, language, and culture. Anglos began arriving in the 1880s in significant numbers via the railroads, but the Nuevo Mexicano elites controlled enough property, the popular vote, and market power to prevent a complete conquest. Mexicans of New Mexico were rebranded Spanish Americans at the turn of the century, 20th century, during their bid for statehood as an English language accommodation between Anglo and Nuevo Mexicano elites in their self-serving pursuit of political and economic power. This distancing was furthered with Mexican Americanism in the 1930s, which defined belonging based on citizenship over other modes of imagining. My analysis of the U.S. Census enumerator sheets estimates there were 11,000 Nuevo Mexicanos living in Los Angeles County by 1940. The 1940 U.S. Census reports there were just over 59,000 people living in Los Angeles County that were born in Mexico. Thus, in 1940, there was one Nuevo Mexicano migrant for every 6 Mexican immigrants. These many Nuevo Mexicano families in 1940 would provide a stable foothold for the 1950s migrants. The top chart shows the steady population growth in urban Bernalillo County and overall in the state between 1930 and 1980. The two charts below show that this was not the case in northern New Mexican rural counties. During the 1950s, northern New Mexico farm numbers declined 67% in only 5 years. The farms could no longer compete commercially, and farmers turned to wage labor to survive. Mexicanos lost land due to unpaid property taxes, and the young had to migrate to send money back home so the family could continue to have a place to live. During the 1950s, the northern New Mexican rural population declined from 93,000 to 84,000. With 25% of the state's population at the start of the decade, the 7 northern counties only had 14% at the end of the decade. These charts use the U.S. Census publication's age distribution groups to determine who was leaving. The data is normalized to the state and plotted for the 20-year intervals 1930, 1950, and 1970. Concentrating on the working age population of 20 to 54, in 1930, urban Bernalillo County was drawing workers into Albuquerque from the rural counties. This continued with younger adults joining the older workers in 1950, and the families stabilized by 1970. Rural Taos and Rio Arriba counties track each other tightly and have a discernible U-shaped curve growing in 1950 that deepens by 1970. This graphically illustrates how working-age adults in rural counties drove the population loss and left the young children and grandparents at home. Young adults left the farms of northern New Mexico, and many New Mexico families were already living in Los Angeles, ready to help them when they arrived. Nelson Gonzalez explained that after getting married to Esperanza, we looked for work in Santa Fe and Taos, and there weren't any jobs available, you know? So luckily, her sister Estefanita, the oldest one of the oldest in the family, she and her husband welcomed us to California. That is why we moved over there, for jobs. 3 trains traveled daily from Santa Fe to Los Angeles with $25 one-way tickets, and it was even less expensive to travel by Greyhound bus at only $17.75. One of the significant changes for 1950s Nuevo Mexicano migrants was that it became commonplace for young adults to own a car. 2 1950 newspaper ads were looking for passengers to share the cost of gasoline to Los Angeles. It is noteworthy there were only 2 ads, and both were going to Los Angeles. 2 years later, Lee's ad only cost him 25 cents to say he was going to Los Angeles and could take 3. In yet another ad, a careful driver looking for 3 passengers was driving to Los Angeles via Route 66 in a large, comfortable car. Passengers who did not own a car knew there were no available local jobs, and they could quickly earn enough in Los Angeles to buy one. The Nuevo Mexicanos that migrated to mid-20th century Los Angeles lived in the same neighborhoods as other Latinos. In 1940, 80% of the Latino population was concentrated in East and Central Los Angeles. But by 1960, 80% of the Spanish surname population of metropolitan Los Angeles lived outside of East Los Angeles. There was a large community in Watts, and the rest lived in diverse, scattered communities. The dominant factor in choosing a neighborhood was to live close to work. In the 1930s, agriculture drew Mexican workers to Pasadena, El Monte, and the San Fernando Valley. By the 1940s, the scattered communities included Culver City, Venice, and Santa Monica. By the 1950s, the defense industry drew workers to Lockheed Aircraft in Burbank and Douglas Aircraft in Santa Monica, Torrance, and Long Beach. Shortly after being discharged from the Army in 1955, 23-year-old Eddie Sisneros left for Los Angeles with his cousin Adonais Archuleta from El Rito, New Mexico. After completing his service, he spent only about 10 days home in El Rito. Eddie explained that when he arrived, Adonais already had a plan to come to Los Angeles with Valentin Jaramillo because he had the car. So he decided to join them. Valentin was living in Los Angeles and was back in New Mexico visiting family. But as Eddie conveyed, what happened is that he met this girl in Santa Fe, and they decided to get married at that time. So me and Adonais were out. We didn't have a ride. That would not stop them, and they took a Greyhound bus to downtown Los Angeles. They knew their friends were living somewhere in Santa Monica, so they went there, quickly found an apartment, and started walking around looking for work. Their friends had cars, and while driving by, they found them walking. They soon all moved in together to apartments near the Pacific Ocean Park in Santa Monica. Despite the 1948 Shelley versus Kramer Supreme Court decision prohibiting racial housing covenants, the Nuevo Mexicanos discovered they could not live just anywhere. Celia Teachea started working at the Beverly Hilton Hotel and soon got her roommates jobs there. Celia explained that they had a for rent sign on a nearby apartment. So we stopped at this place close to the Hilton and asked if we could see the apartments, and they told us they didn't rent to Mexicans. When asked how she processed this racist rebuff, Celia said, "Well, the way I felt was that we were in a high society place, Hollywood, to begin with. So I figured maybe they don't rent to Mexicans. And we are Mexicans, so..." There was unquestionably a racial divide back at home, but this overt racialized housing was new for the Nuevo Mexicanos. Celia's experience and response revealed the fragile, shifting nature of belonging. Nuevo Mexicanos Mexican Americans, and Mexican immigrants all experience the same forms of discrimination. Nelson Gonzalez recounted, when we first moved there, Esperanza worked for a finance company, and she was telling me the manager had two systems of interest they charged for loans. It was a loan company. And for the white folks, it was a different rate of interest for the Mexicans. All Latinos were called Mexicans. If you had a Spanish surname, you were called a Mexican. Esperanza was very upset about the rates, and they decided that with Nelson's salary, she should quit the job and resume her college education at Cal State Los Angeles. Unfortunately, the academic environment was not clear of racism either. Esperanza wrote a detailed term paper for a history class that she invested a great deal of time researching at the Huntington Library. When the grades were posted, Esperanza saw that everyone except her received an A. When she met the professor to discuss the paper, who greeted her curtly, he said, "Well, I have a question for you." He asked Esperanza, "Who wrote this paper for you?" And she said, "I wrote it." And he said, "No, Mexicans don't write this way." Esperanza did not let these negative experiences stop her, and she graduated with a degree in mathematics while raising 3 children. They moved back to New Mexico in 1967, where Esperanza became a teacher, and Nelson returned to Highland University to earn his master's degree. The availability of jobs in the post-war economy of Los Angeles attracted the migrants. A government report during World War II documents that over half the young men from New Mexico either joined the military or moved for defense industry jobs, mainly to California. The report deals with Spanish-speaking migrants trained as welders, mechanics, and craftsmen in a federally funded program. During the 1950s, there were regular newspaper job advertisements for military contractors, Douglas Aircraft Company, and General Dynamics in New Mexico newspapers. There were side-by-side ads in the Albuquerque Tribune for work in Los Angeles as die makers, manufacturing supervisors, and production assistants. Nelson Gonzalez worked as a machinist of precision aircraft parts at several jobs in Los Angeles, including Lockheed. After a week in Los Angeles, Jerry Sisneros found a job in Santa Monica with a company that finished aircraft control panels for defense contractors, such as Douglas Aircraft. His cousin Adonais retired after working decades for McDonnell Douglas before returning to New Mexico. There were plenty of jobs and the pay was good. After a month of walking back and forth to work, Eddie was able to put a payment down on a car, remembering, "That's when I got my Plymouth." Nelson Gonzalez remembered he had good relations with the diverse Latino workforce. There were a big percentage of Mexicans here. There were Cubans, Argentinians, you name it, from many different countries. Nelson warmly recalled that his mentor was an expert machinist from Mexico. Besides the U.S. citizen Nuevo Mexicanos, there were immigrants from several Latin American countries. But in the eyes of Anglo managers, Nelson said, if you are Gonzalez and dark skin like me, you're a Mexican in their eyes. Eddie worked with several Mexican nationals, including 2 co-workers who lived nearby that soon became good friends. Eddie was still single and fondly recalled they often went to each other's apartments to eat, drink, and play cards. Many of these young adults soon got married and began to have children. The families typically socialized within their kinship network. Sally recalled that each Sunday, 4 families from New Mexico rotated homes to get together after church and spend the afternoon talking, making dinner, and eating together. Couples often returned to New Mexico to get married, to attend weddings and funerals. Wedding and funeral announcements were frequent in New Mexico newspapers and often included Nuevo Mexicanos in Los Angeles. The links back to New Mexico were strong, and the families made it a point to visit home at least once a year. Sally explained, I promised it to myself, okay, that I'm going to visit my mom every year on my vacation, and I'm going to take my children over there. Anthony Macias' monograph on popular culture, Mexican-American Mojo, is one of the few works that cover the social life of the period. Macias' primary focus is on music, but an intimate look at Los Angeles Latino culture using neighborhoods, nightclubs, and fashion is threaded throughout his cultural history. Examples of people relocating between Los Angeles, New Mexico, Texas, and Mexico pepper the narrative and highlight the regional kinship web. Nuevo Mexicanos have always loved to dance. Celia Teachea said from the time she moved to Los Angeles, every weekend we would go dancing. We went to Zenda's Ballroom, which was right across from the Statler Hotel downtown. And then we went to the Sombrero, and then we went in Hollywood to the Palladium. Oh my God, that was beautiful. Macias describes all three of these Latin dance clubs in detail, and the dialogue between his monograph and the voice of a regular dancer at the clubs paints a vivid portrait of 1950s Los Angeles. This is some recent work on the La Veinte Mexican neighborhood in Santa Monica, shown in blue on the map. A recent video microhistory of La Veinte highlights the Casillas family from Jalisco, which echoes the conventional immigrant narrative. Using details from the 1940 census enumerator sheets, I found that 25% of the quote-unquote Mexican population in Santa Monica were actually from New Mexico. Half of the Nuevo Mexicano families lived in the La Veinte neighborhood, and 25% were marriages between Mexican nationals and New Mexican citizens. Their children extended the regional kinship network spanning Los Angeles, New Mexico, and Mexico. My work narrates the relationships between Nuevo Mexicano migrant and Mexican immigrant communities in mid-20th century Los Angeles to highlight their shared experiences as migrant wage laborers and chronicle their extension of the regional kinship network. They lived in the same neighborhoods, were co-workers, and socialized together. This narrative adds historical complexity and broadens the heterogeneity of the Latino experience to counter myths that drive today's Latino immigrant discourse. Bringing these families into the historical record restores voices ignored by Mexican-American historiography, both Chicano and Hispano. New borderlands families continue to weave the kinship web with their shared experiences in the 21st century. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Jerry. Very interesting. And I've got a couple of questions for you. And I guess the first one is, what, if any, differences did your research identify between Nuevo Mexicanos who migrated from Mexico, Nuevo Mexicanos who immigrated from Mexico, and immigrants from Mexico?
The thesis research picks this up specifically and details the Bracero program and its role in the position of the documented labor force during the 1950s, 1960s. Basically transitions a mixed agricultural workforce that included Mexican Americans, Nuevo Mexicanos, at the beginning of the period, like in the 1930s and beginning of 1940s, to by the 1960s, it was 100% Mexican immigrant workforce. One of the parts of the differences between the two communities was that some of the archival research I did at the Southwest Research Center in Albuquerque, New Mexico, at the University of New Mexico, I dug into Senator Dennis Chavez's paper. And one of the things was that Mexican Americans, Nuevo Mexicanos, were being visited as betweens, effectively, between the Mexican workers, also manual laborers, and management. We also found this in Los Angeles. A lot of these smaller factories that were fairly dangerous at the times, things you wouldn't do, like spray painting, enclosed areas, dangerous things, basically. And so what was happening was one of the differences were that Mexican Americans were becoming a class that would offer Anglo managers to Mexican workers.
Thank you. And did you find any linguistic differences between these groups? For instance, were the Nuevo Mexicanos in New Mexico? Were they bilingual, or perhaps the immigrants from directly from Mexico were not?
That's an interesting question. The mid-century group from Nuevo Mexicanos were raised in the rural villages. They were raised in Spanish-speaking households. The communities were completely 100% Spanish-speaking. However, went to school. They were English-only policies at school. And this was also at the end of the 1930s. And a lot of the programs that they were relying for sustenance, like the Civilian Conservation Corps, UPA program, basically were English only environment. So beyond that, with those only policies at school, there was actually physical punishments meted out to the children. One of the accounts I used in the thesis was where a principal would turn a rude glass ring around and have the on the inside of his hand, and he would whack the kids on the head if he heard them speaking Spanish. Well, what happened as a result of that? Well, that generation, the children that they raised, they did not speak Spanish to them. They did not teach them Spanish. So it was almost a complete 100% lost Spanish language in the following generation. It's created a huge division in the community. Of course, you can transmit culture very easily with that language. So that language is actually a major section within the thesis work.
Well, thank you. And I can relate to them turning the ring around and smacking the kid on the head, because that happened to a colleague of mine who went to a Catholic school in Los Angeles. The guy, the priest actually broke his knuckle with one of those half-inch rods. So, you know, some schools had an interesting idea of punishment. I was interested in the rural folks leaving their farms because the lack of being able to make a living on the farm at a certain point, and moving to the Albuquerque area to get jobs in the big city. And your charts about showing the U-curve, where it seems like they would grow up in a rural area, they would go to Albuquerque and spend most of their working life there, but then they would come back to the area they grew up in.
Yes. We want to comment on that. That's actually a topic that's picked up in the thesis as well. What explored in the thesis is the commonality of various migration forms with Mexican immigrants and the Nuevo Mexicano population. There was, of course, people that came and moved here to Los Angeles permanently. A significant number went back and returned to their communities, and that was their sense of belonging. That a lot of these people base their priorities of belonging on place and the kinship web back at home. So they would return for that. Fighting that in this time was rising nationalism with the Mexicans and it's termed de afuera, the revolutionary group that felt that they were the true Mexicans that lived outside, being sold out basically by the PRI government. And in New Mexico as well, there was a significant group of people that really wanted to return home. And what I argue in the paper is that those circular movements, the multi-directional movements, mixture of population propagated Berland's kinship work.
Really an interesting presentation. We appreciate you making your time to come tonight and share with the rest of the group and all the folks on the webinar.